California, 1970. A devastating wildfire has spread and annihilated thousands of acres, causing creatures big and small to flee for their lives. The three creatures that show up on this doctor's property and the encounters he has with them makes him say that it altered his whole view of reality. Hear all about it next. Welcome to WILLSTAR Monsters and Mysteries. Today I have an encounter by a doctor and his family who encounter a family unit of Sasquatch-like creatures. An adult male, a female, and a smaller juvenile. This occurred right after the Laguna Wildfire of California of 1970, which burned up over 175,000 acres of wilderness, canyonlands, mountain areas, forests, etc. I have some information out of John Green's book, Sasquatch the Apes Among Us, and then I also have an interview from 1992 with one of the police officers that was directly involved with the investigation. So as always, if you like the video, make sure you hit that like button for me. If you're new to the channel and you like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe. What I do is I give you the encounters and I show you the location while I'm doing it using Google Earth. Alright, as always, that's enough about that. Let's go ahead and get into this. Los Angeles County Police Detective and Sasquatch investigator Ken Kuhn has this to say about the incident. The strangest looking footprints I have ever seen were found near San Diego. The story behind the discovery of these prints and the apparent reliability of our informant made this one of the most interesting cases. Our informant, a respected San Diego physician, had purchased a ranch home in the mountains a few miles east of San Diego. One night shortly after buying the property, as he, his wife, and their daughter drove into their driveway, the headlights illuminated a large, upright, hairy creature, apparently eating apples from the orchard in the front of the house. Upon the car's approach, the big monkey, as the doctor refers to it, disappeared into the darkness. Upon searching the area in daylight, he found a number of strange four-toed tracks that were very broad towards the front and tapered to a thinner heel. The doctor also noted other strange circumstances. Many of the trees in his orchard had been stripped of apples to a height well beyond a man's normal reach, and there was no evidence that anyone had been there with a ladder. He also observed the same strange footprints near his chicken house, and even more odd, the small structure itself appeared to have been moved slightly off its foundations. The doctor did some checking with his neighbors and found that they too had experienced some strange occurrences in the past weeks. By the time the news of the sighting reached me, the doctor and his family had been badly frightened by further encounters with the quote-unquote big monkeys, and he had taken to the habit of carrying a .44 Magnum whenever working around the ranch. He described the creatures to me as heavily built, upright walking, dark-colored things, looking more like apes than men. The doctor said he and his family had seen as many as 3 of these creatures in the orchard at one time, the largest at least 6 feet tall. He also pointed out the large floodlights he had installed and was pleased to report that the creatures had not returned since he started using the lights. In the course of our investigation, we were contacted by a nearby rancher who showed us strange footprints which he had found on his property. Sure enough, this lone print in powder dust clearly showed an odd V-shaped foot with 4 toes. The print was 14 inches long and 10 inches wide at its broadest point. The following day, while searching the bank of a reservoir a short distance away, we discovered 2 sets of similar but smaller footprints. Subsequent investigations in that area have failed to turn up any more prints. However, we have spoken with several ranchers who have told strange stories of the monsters, frightening their livestock and occasionally carrying off great numbers of chickens or ducks, leaving only their strange-looking 4-toed footprints behind. Okay, just go ahead and tell me about yourself, when you started working there, and so on. I started working in the Alpine area in March of 1970. I came to the department the previous year. I was working out there in patrol capacity for the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. I was a deputy at the time and actually worked Alpine for about 2 years, from March of 1970 to April of 1972. As far as trying to recall exactly when this went down, the best that I can come up with is that it was after the Laguna Fire of 1970, September of 1970. The Laguna Fire affected which areas? Well, it was the largest brush fire at the time in California history, and burned specifically in the Sweetwater River area from east of Alpine all the way south and west, probably another 15 miles. It was quite an extensive burn and through the area in question, Alpine, on the south side of Interstate 8. To recall the chain of events, it was extremely cold, which means the time of the year would have been sometime after September of 1970. Probably December or January, maybe February. Let's see. That would be 1971. Well, it was definitely winter. Was that about the time of your first contact with the key witness, Dr. Badur? Yes. I don't recall the reason, but Dr. Badur was stopped by a two-man patrol unit. Badur was traveling eastbound, which would have been from the San Diego area to what we later learned was his home in Alpine. On the front seat of his car, I don't remember what kind of car it was, he had a loaded .44 Magnum revolver with a 6-inch barrel. That's the same type of gun that Dirty Harry made famous.
Being this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and will blow your head clean off. You've got to ask yourself the question, do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
It's the largest caliber handgun you can buy. Of course, this piqued our interest a little bit. I wasn't the contact, I was what we call the cover during this particular stop. My partner is the one who made first contact and found the gun. He secured the revolver and was asking the doctor, who'd identified himself as Dr. Badur, why he was carrying the weapon. Badur said it was because of and I don't know what he actually said at the time, but my partner heard him say Zuby. And from then on, all of our conversations throughout the department referred to whatever Dr. Badur had seen as a Zuby. That wasn't what the doctor actually called it, I don't believe, but that's what my partner heard, and that's how the name got coined. At the time, did Dr. Badur describe the Zuby to the officer? Yes, he did, to both of us as a matter of fact. He described the Zuby as a large, upright, walking, hairy creature. Dr. Badur convinced us and later other members of my department, including one of my patrol sergeants, that in truth he'd had 3 separate encounters with the Zubis. Did Dr. Badur say how many of these Zubis there were and where the sightings happened? Yeah, one sighting was made by his entire family within the confines of his yard and immediate area, and at one time they saw 3 Zubis. What Dr. Badur described to us was that he assumed was a father, mother, and child, with the largest of the Zubis being over 6 feet tall, maybe 7 feet tall. The tallest was very hairy and much larger frame than an ordinary man. What he described as the mother was about 5 feet tall, and the smaller one was about 3 or 4 feet tall. Like I said, the doctor convinced a number of us that he'd in fact seen something unusual. What happened then was that we did get involved in an investigation of the sightings. I did because the shift I worked, which was either 10 p.m. at night to 6 a.m., or what we call the evening or overlapped shift, which was from 6 p.m. to 2:30 in the morning. Neither of those shifts was conducive to interviewing citizens in the area, so I wasn't able to locate other witnesses, and I can't recall if I ever talked to a deputy who canvassed the area looking for witnesses. How many people lived in the area at the time? There were very few homes, probably 5 or no more than 6 residences, and the Badurs was the last home on the narrow road. Going back in my memory 20 years now, I'd say his house was 1/4 to 1/3 of a mile off the main road used to get to his place, almost in a straight line due south of Alpine Boulevard. That area hasn't grown much since then, no planned residential development in there. At that time, the Badur family themselves consisted of the doctor, his wife, a daughter, and a son. The daughter was 17 and the son was younger, maybe 13 or 14. Can you describe what the terrain looks like? Is it actually alpine forest, etc.? It's not a forest by any means. The elevation's no more than 2,300 feet. The road goes east and up, and in about another 20 miles, it eventually climbs to about 5,000 feet. Does it continue up into forested areas? Yes, it does, and it follows the Sweetwater River. It's about 10 miles. The Sweetwater River isn't much of a flowing river. It runs about 3/4 of a mile south of Dr. Badur's place. Of course, it's always dependent on rainfall, but the river hasn't run continuously any time in the 20 years I've been familiar with the area. There's no snowfall at all. The terrain itself is quite steep behind Dr. Badur's property, going down into the Sweetwater River bottom itself. It's all primarily brush and chaparral. Any bears in the area? I don't think I've ever heard of a bear sighting in San Diego County. And again, I've been in the area almost 23 years. We have deer everywhere here along with coyotes and fox and other type of wildlife, but no bears. What else do you remember about Dr. Badur's sightings? Let's see. The first set of circumstances I remember was Dr. Badur finding damage to the house when he just moved in. He said he bought the house from an older German couple and all of the light bulbs inside and out were the yellow bug repellent type. Badur said the German man told him that he shouldn't change them to white, that he should get used to the yellow light. Because of an insect problem? Badur said the German was very evasive about that. Evasive also about a lot of the details regarding the house and property. The property did have some acreage. I don't recall the size, but it was larger than a city lot anyway. The property had some fruit trees in the front and backyards. I don't remember what kind of fruit trees they were, but the house and the trees were surrounded by a fence. One of Badur's complaints was that the fruit was being picked off the trees at the tops, but not from the bottoms. The trees were upward of 7 to 8 feet high, or maybe 10 feet high. Anyway, the fruit was disappearing from the tops of his trees and his fence was getting knocked down. He had a wind chime at one of the doors made of brass or some kind of strong metal which frequently rang in the blowing wind, and at one point the wind chime suddenly turned up flattened. Badur couldn't explain it and we couldn't duplicate it. It was smashed. Badur did make a plaster cast of a footprint and I know we had photographs of it, if we didn't in fact have a plaster cast of the print ourselves. But I do recall there was a plaster cast. Do you remember the approximate size of the footprint? I'm 6'3" and I wear a size 12 shoe, and I have to say this was larger than my shoe and much wider than my foot. I'd say it was about 13 or 14 inches in length, and I've been racking my brain trying to remember if it had 4 or 5 toes, but I just can't recall. But there's some recollection that it might have had an unusual number of toes? Yes, I do remember that, but I can't bring it to mind. I know the footprint was wide overall and less wide at the heel, but the heel was still wider than a human foot would be. Did you or any of the officers talk to the doctor's wife or kids? Specifically, the word came back to me, and I'm not sure which deputy found out, but the daughter said she had a sighting in the early morning hours as she boarded a school bus at Alpine Boulevard. That would have been adjacent to the access road leading to the Badur house. She was getting on the bus and spotted the creature off in the brush. There's some very thick, very tall brush along the road there. Do you remember any details of what she saw? No, not really. The man who was deeply involved in this was my patrol sergeant, and he's now deceased. He was so involved with it that on his days off he'd go up there and camp to the rear of the Badur's house. He'd take his older son along, and the two of them would camp out in hopes of getting a glimpse of one of the zoobies. They never did, but he was the man who probably had more conversations with the doctor than anybody else. The Badurs had made it a habit to never go out after dark, but one night they were out with the son to call in their pet dog. In the dark, the boy thought he saw the dog near the corner of the house and called out to it. Well, the dog came running back, but from a different corner. And what at first they thought was the dog turned out to be the smaller Zuby. Apparently, it had been laying down, and it got up and stood and walked the opposite way, joining the other two, the larger male and the female, and they all walked off into the brush. Did they ever use words like ape or gorilla to describe the creatures? No, they never did. Badur was firm in his own mind that it wasn't an ape or gorilla. It was something totally different than one of those. Well, for the lack of anything better, we thought it to be more like the California Bigfoot, based on how it was described. Whether it was black or brown, I really can't remember. Did Dr. Badur ever use the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch to describe the Zuby? Not to me, no. As a matter of fact, we were assigned to make periodic checks of his residence throughout the night because most of the damage to his property was done during the nighttime. So my partner and I in a 2-man car would drive up there and shine the spotlight around his house. Dr. Badur was very convincing. I can still picture him coming outdoors one night dressed in his skivvies and wearing black high-top military boots. That was it. A t-shirt and shorts with those black boots and carrying that big .44 Magnum.
Go ahead. Make my day.
How would you characterize the family? It sounds as though they were all educated, credible people? Yes, I'd characterize them as exactly that. I got the impression the daughter was very intelligent, and of course Badur himself was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. In our earlier phone call to arrange this interview, you mentioned something about the creatures, the Zoobies, mimicking human speech? Yes. One of the crazier stories I recall happened when the doctor got home after dark one night. They had chickens there, and earlier he'd called his wife to say he was going to be late and to remind her to feed the chickens before nightfall, which she did. When the doctor got home, he had to exit his car, open the gate, drive through, and stopped, then got out of the car again to close the gate behind him. He said that when he went to close the gate that night, he heard a very low, very guttural voice say, "Hey, chickie, chickie, chickie." That's crazy and not unprecedented in the research. Are you saying the impression was that one of the creatures was imitating the doctor's wife who had called the chickens earlier? Exactly. It was the doctor's opinion, and we had no reason to doubt him that the Zubi had some type of intelligence and the capability of producing sounds like that. Did they ever describe any other sounds or smells? Anything like that? Smells? Yes. A very pungent odor, maybe like rotting garbage. You know, he did tell us he'd set up cameras all around the house with tripwires, but he wasn't able to get any photographs, at least not while I was working in the area. I really can't recall, but I know the doctor himself had a close sighting of one of the Zubis, and there were probably other sightings, but I can't remember now. Of course, I worked up there for just those 2 years, until April of 1972. After that, I went to fly helicopters, so I was completely out of touch with what was happening in Alpine, and I didn't get back there until 1981. At that time, I was stationed east of the Badur home, and I didn't hear anything more. I did hear something about the Proctor Valley Monster when I started patrol in 1970, which if true, I'd have to assume was on the order of what Dr. Badur was describing. Now, a few years ago, a deputy told me he saw a dark-colored, large, upright, furry creature, not a bear and not human, up in some rocks north of Interstate 8 and possibly again northwest of El Capitan Reservoir. The deputy told me it was a good distance away. Also, I was involved in a juvenile diversion camp near Julian, northeast of Alpine, and a couple of counselors from another camp came down and told us they'd seen something that they couldn't identify in the mountains. After talking with them, it was concluded that what they'd seen was probably a Zubi. Another thing we found out during our investigation of Dr. Badur's sightings was that the Vajeas Indians, just north of Interstate 8, had a legend about a hairy man that was the protector of their burial grounds. And those burial grounds were located just about 2 miles north of where Dr. Badur lived.